Inside America's Death Row, the controversial execution of Cameron Todd Willingham, true crime documentary. It all started on a cold December night in 1991, 2 days before Christmas. Cameron Todd Willingham woke up in his home in Corsicana, Texas. In the dark, he smelled smoke. Panic flooded him. He scrambled to his children's room, hoping to save his babies, but the fire roared too fast. He tried to break down the door. He screamed for his daughters. When firefighters arrived, there was nothing left but flames and ruins. His 3 little girls, Amber, 2 years old, and twin 1-year-olds, Carmen and Cameron, were gone forever. His heart must have shattered in that moment. But here's the shock. Investigators soon claimed that the fire wasn't an accident. They said it was arson, set on purpose, and that Cameron Todd Willingham did it. They accused him of pouring a dangerous liquid, maybe something like lighter fluid, around his home to ignite that deadly blaze. Courtroom after courtroom followed. At his trial, a jailhouse informant testified that Willingham admitted to starting the fire. That confession rocked the jury. The arson investigator pointed to burn patterns in strange glass, claiming they showed the fire was planned, not accidental. Despite his pleas of innocence, Cameron was convicted and sentenced to death. Can you imagine that? A father mourning his daughters, standing before a judge and jury, all while insisting he did not kill them. But that was just the beginning. As the years dragged on, forensic experts began to question everything. They said the evidence used in his trial was based on flawed science, junk fire investigation techniques. Some scientists called the original findings unscientific, more like the work of mystics. According to later reviews, there was no real proof that he used an accelerant to start the fire. As his execution date loomed, people gathered. Some believed he was innocent. Others said justice had to be done. When the day came, on February 17, 2004, Cameron stood strapped to the gurney. His final words cut deep. "The only statement I want to make is that I'm an innocent man, convicted of a crime I did not commit."
But just after his death, a storm of doubt erupted. Experts later re-examined his case. They argued that the fire theories used during his trial were no longer valid, even discredited. And jailhouse testimony. Incredibly, the man who claimed Willingham confessed recanted, saying he was pressured with promises. So, here's where we pause. At the turning point, a man convicted of killing his own children, executed for it. But now, serious questions tear at the foundation of that verdict. Was he truly guilty, or was justice horribly wrong? And that's exactly where it gets even more shocking. The night Cameron Todd Willingham was led to the execution chamber didn't just shock his family and friends, it shook an entire nation. But before that grim day, everything started much earlier in the heart of Texas, in a small town called Corsicana. Cameron was a young man full of energy, living what seemed like an ordinary life. He had friends, a girlfriend, and 3 little daughters who adored him. To outsiders, he appeared like any other father, any other neighbor in his quiet community. Yet, one December evening in 1991, the life Cameron knew would collapse into chaos. Firefighters arrived at his burning home, and the world learned of the devastating blaze that claimed the lives of his 3 daughters. The U.S. media quickly covered the story, and the tragedy became a headline in Texas newspapers. But soon, the story shifted from grief to accusation. Investigators claimed it wasn't an accident. The fire had been set deliberately. And Cameron Todd Willingham, a grieving father, became the prime suspect. The first shock to the public and to those following this true crime story was the nature of the investigation. The arson experts pointed to unusual burn patterns and glass shards, claiming they were proof of accelerants, dangerous liquids like gasoline, being used to start the fire. They said these patterns could only appear if the fire was deliberately set. News outlets across the U.S. reported it as a case of horrifying parental murder, painting Cameron as the villain. But as time would reveal, these proofs were deeply flawed. Court documents showed that during the trial, prosecutors heavily relied on these so-called scientific findings. They brought in fire investigators who were later criticized for using outdated and unreliable techniques. They testified that the burn patterns indicated arson, but forensic experts later explained that such patterns could also appear in normal house fires. Even the so-called accelerant traces were questionable. The original evidence that sent Cameron Todd Willingham to death row in Texas was not as solid as everyone believed.
Adding to the tension, a jailhouse informant claimed that Cameron had confessed to starting the fire. This testimony became a crucial part of the prosecution's case. Yet in the years after Cameron's execution, the informant admitted he had lied, pressured by promises of leniency and benefits. The U.S. legal system, meant to protect the innocent, had allowed flawed testimony to influence life and death decisions. This revelation caused outrage among true crime enthusiasts, legal experts, and the general public alike. Life on death row is a nightmare. Cameron was moved to the Polunsky Unit in Texas, a high-security prison for male inmates sentenced to death. Here, inmates spend 23 hours a day in a small cell with minimal contact with the outside world. Guards watch every movement, and the sound of clanging doors and footsteps echoes constantly. The isolation, combined with the weight of knowing that execution is inevitable, creates an environment of constant tension and fear. Many prisoners on U.S. death row suffer severe mental stress, and Cameron was no exception. Despite the oppressive conditions, Cameron fought to prove his innocence. He wrote letters, requested appeals, and asked for independent fire investigations. Experts from around the U.S. analyzed the evidence, publishing reports that contradicted the original findings. They stated clearly, there was no proof Cameron Todd Willingham set the fire, yet the state of Texas remained determined to carry out the execution. Each court appeal was denied, each request for review dismissed. The tension between justice, law, and public opinion was growing louder. Meanwhile, public interest in this true crime case intensified. Documentaries, news features, and investigative articles highlighted the shocking facts of the trial. People debated, could a man be executed for a crime he did not commit? How could the justice system allow flawed science and unreliable testimony to decide life and death? The Cameron Todd Willingham case became a symbol of controversy around the U.S. death row system. As the years passed, the story of Cameron's final days on death row took on an almost surreal quality. Guards, witnesses, and journalists described the execution day in vivid detail. Cameron remained calm and collected, facing the end with dignity. He gave interviews to reporters and maintained his plea of innocence until the very end. The weight of tragedy, injustice, and human emotion hung in the air, a chilling reminder of the stakes on death row in America. And then came the moment that would haunt Texas and the U.S. justice system forever. Cameron Todd Willingham was strapped to the gurney. His words echoed, "I am innocent of this crime." But the lethal injection began. Within minutes, his life ended. Spectators left the chamber in silence. Outside, debates raged. Could a mistake have been made? Could a man be wrongly executed, based on evidence later proven unreliable? This was the moment when the story of America's death row inmates revealed its deepest, darkest questions. And just when people thought the controversy had ended, new findings would emerge. Forensic scientists published reports questioning everything about the fire and arson claims. The very foundation of the conviction had crumbled. Cameron's case became a case study in wrongful execution, a topic still discussed in true crime documentaries and legal forums today.
But as shocking as Cameron Todd Willingham's story is, the layers of mystery and injustice are far from over. The next chapter will reveal the final twists, the human stories inside the prison, and the consequences that shocked the nation and the world about death row in America. The sun rose over Texas, but there was no light for Cameron Todd Willingham. His story on America's death row had reached its tragic peak, yet the questions it raised would linger long after his death. As news of his execution spread across the United States, people began to confront a horrifying possibility. A man may have been executed for a crime he did not commit. The nation's fascination with true crime intensified. People watched documentaries, read articles, and debated in forums about the failures in the U.S. death row system. Cameron's execution sparked outrage among legal experts, scientists, and the public. Experts in fire investigation revisited the case. They tested the evidence, analyzed the burn patterns, and reviewed the techniques used by the original arson investigators. Their conclusions shocked the nation. The fire that killed Cameron's 3 daughters could have been entirely accidental. The so-called accelerant patterns could appear naturally in a house fire. There was no physical proof Cameron Todd Willingham intentionally set the blaze. Even the jailhouse informant who claimed he confessed admitted later that he lied. Across the country, the media ran headlines questioning the justice system. Was America's death row wrong? Could the innocent be executed? Flawed science leads to execution. Every headline reminded the public that Cameron Todd Willingham's case was not just a tragedy for one man. It was a warning about the dangers of wrongful convictions, flawed forensics, and extreme punishment. True crime fans and advocates for prison reform began sharing his story widely. YouTube videos, social media posts, and documentary channels highlighted Cameron's story as one of the most shocking cases in modern U.S. history. Inside the prison, the conditions Cameron endured were harrowing. He had spent over a decade in the Polensky unit, a high-security facility known for isolation and psychological pressure. Inmates were confined to their small cells for 23 hours a day. Meals were served through slots in heavy doors. Guards patrolled constantly, their eyes watching every movement. The isolation, combined with the weight of facing execution, created extreme mental stress. Yet Cameron never stopped asserting his innocence. He wrote letters, requested appeals, and pushed for further investigations. Even on death row, he became a symbol of resistance against injustice. The legal fallout after Cameron's execution was just beginning. Scholars, journalists, and lawyers analyzed the case for years. The U.S. government, legal organizations, and death penalty opponents cited his case as proof that lethal injection and death row procedures could be fatal for the innocent. Reforms were discussed, from stricter evidence standards to independent reviews of execution cases. Cameron Todd Willingham became a case study in how America's death row system can fail. And his story continues to influence true crime documentaries today.
What made his story especially haunting was the human element. Cameron had 3 daughters who died in a fire he may not have caused. A man spent years in isolation, waiting for execution, all while proclaiming his innocence. Families, friends, and witnesses were torn between grief, anger, and disbelief. True crime enthusiasts and ordinary Americans alike were forced to confront the moral and ethical implications of the death penalty. Could a single flawed conviction end a life permanently? Could an innocent father die for a tragedy that wasn't his fault? Even now, years after his death, Cameron Todd Willingham's case continues to dominate discussions about wrongful convictions and death row executions. Investigators have analyzed similar fire cases and wrongful execution claims. Legal reforms and public awareness campaigns use his story as an example of why caution, scientific rigor, and fairness are critical in U.S. death row procedures. As for Cameron's legacy, it is complicated and powerful. He is remembered not just as a man convicted and executed, but as a symbol of what can go wrong in the pursuit of justice. His name appears in documentaries, in academic studies, and on YouTube channels dedicated to real American crime stories. Every mention of Cameron Todd Willingham sparks curiosity, debate, and outrage. And every time someone watches a true crime documentary about his life, they're reminded of the stakes. Justice must be measured carefully because once life is taken on death row, there is no undoing it. The shocking truth of Cameron Todd Willingham's story is simple but chilling. Even in a system meant to protect the innocent, mistakes happen and the consequences are irreversible. From the fiery night in Corsicana to the cold gurney in the Polensky unit, his life and death exposed the darkest realities of death row in America. For those who follow true crime, his story is more than history. It's a lesson that every detail in the death row case matters, that flawed evidence, unreliable witnesses, and untested theories can cost a life. And most importantly, Cameron Todd Willingham's case reminds us that true crime is not always entertainment. Sometimes it is a warning.